By the early 1940 seconds, the skies over Europe no longer belonged to chance or courage. They belonged to instruments. In the darkness above the continent, German radar stations traced the night with silent certainty. What had once been an ally to bombers, blackness, cloud, and distance, was now exposed. Aircraft were detected long before they crossed the coast. Courses were predicted. Interceptors were waiting. For the German Air Defense Command, radar transformed war into geometry. Systems like Freya and Würzburg reduced the sky to coordinates and timing. Night fighters climbed with purpose, guided not by sight but by signals. Anti-aircraft guns fired not at shadows but at calculated points in space. The night sky was no longer empty. It was mapped, measured, and controlled. Among Allied crews, the effect was devastating. Bombers flew deeper into Europe, believing darkness would protect them, only to be intercepted with chilling accuracy. Losses mounted. Entire formations vanished before reaching their targets. Each mission reinforced the same conclusion. The enemy could see in the dark. And worse, they seemed unbeatable there. Within Allied command rooms, frustration hardened into belief. German radar appeared to represent a permanent advantage, one built on superior science and industrial discipline. Attempts to jam signals or outrun detection failed repeatedly. Engineers searched for complex answers to a complex problem, convinced that only advanced technology could defeat advanced technology. Yet the true irony of the moment lay in what the Allies did not yet understand. The German system, for all its sophistication, rested on a fragile assumption. That radar reflections told the truth, that every echo represented metal, speed, and intent. It was a faith placed not in men, but in machines. As the air war stalled and losses grew unsustainable, Allied scientists were forced to reconsider first principles. What if radar did not need to be destroyed? What if it could simply be deceived? In quiet rooms far from the front lines, attention shifted away from transmitters and toward reflections, because somewhere, in an unremarkable workspace, a realization was forming, one that would soon turn Germany's greatest strength into its greatest blindness. By the middle years of the war, German radar was spoken of with a mixture of admiration and dread. It was not merely equipment, it was a system, a doctrine, a confidence. From the North Sea to the heart of the Reich, antennas rotated methodically, scanning the night with mathematical patience. Signals returned as glowing traces, each one translating darkness into certainty. For Germany's air defenders, the sky had become readable. This technology reshaped belief on both sides of the conflict. To German commanders, radar represented the pinnacle of modern warfare, an invisible net capable of finding aircraft long before engines could be heard or shapes discerned. Night fighters no longer searched blindly. They were guided, vectored, delivered to their targets with clinical efficiency. Precision replaced guesswork. Control replaced chaos. For the Allies, the realization landed with force. Night raids, once seen as a solution to daylight slaughter, were proving just as lethal. Aircraft were intercepted with unnerving regularity. Evasion failed. Loss reports grew thicker with each operation. Without a way to defeat German radar, the logic was unavoidable. The night itself had been conquered, and with it, Allied strategy stood on the edge of collapse. Yet within this apparent dominance lay a quiet irony. German radar was advanced, but it was not discerning. It assumed that every reflection was real, every echo meaningful. The system trusted its returns completely, never questioning whether the sky might be lying. Its strength depended on clarity. Its weakness waited in confusion. As months passed, Allied frustration deepened. Crews flew, knowing they were seen. Commanders authorized missions knowing losses would be severe. Engineers worked relentlessly, testing countermeasures that failed more often than they succeeded. The radar net tightened, and escape seemed increasingly improbable. Then, almost imperceptibly, the balance shifted. Not through brute force or superior machinery, but through insight. Allied researchers began to understand that radar did not need to be destroyed to be defeated. It needed to be overwhelmed, deceived, fed more information than it could interpret. What followed was not a weapon in the traditional sense, but a concept, one that exploited the very trust German radar placed in its own vision. And once that realization took hold, the most powerful eyes in the night were about to be blinded by their own certainty. The shock did not come from a thunderous test or a revolutionary machine. It came quietly, almost embarrassingly so. In controlled trials, a handful of Allied aircraft released thin strips of aluminum foil into the air, nothing more than reflective fragments cut to precise lengths. On radar screens, the effect was immediate. The sky filled with echoes. Targets multiplied. Clarity dissolved into noise. At first, belief came cautiously. Allied scientists and commanders had been disappointed too often to trust simplicity. The idea that such a modest countermeasure could disrupt one of the most sophisticated air defense systems in the world seemed almost irresponsible. The technique was given a deliberately plain name, window, as if understatement might shield it from scrutiny. Tests continued. Results repeated. Radar screens lied when asked the wrong questions. The irony was unmistakable. German radar, the pride of modern warfare, could be undone not by superior electronics, but by confusion. Each strip of foil reflected radio waves just as an aircraft would. Thousands of false targets bloomed at once, overwhelming operators trained to trust what they saw. The machines could not distinguish threat from illusion. They only reported reflections, faithfully and fatally. With this realization came urgency. The Allies understood that timing mattered as much as discovery. If deployed too early, the Germans might adapt. If delayed, more crews would be lost. Engineers refined release methods. Air crews were trained in secrecy. Every calculation was precise. Every rehearsal constrained by the knowledge that failure would confirm German dominance rather than break it. Then came the moment of truth. On the night window was used operationally, bombers crossed the coast and released their cargo of metal strips. Within minutes, German radar screens became unreadable. Operators reported massive formations where none existed, and emptiness where aircraft flew freely. Fighters were misdirected. Flak fired into nothing. The night, once controlled, collapsed into chaos. For the first time in years, Allied aircraft moved unseen through hostile skies. Losses fell dramatically. Missions succeeded not because German defenses were destroyed, but because they were blinded by excess information. The balance of power shifted not through force, but through deception. For years, German radar had been treated as something close to infallible. Its operators trusted it implicitly. Its commanders built strategy around it. The system was engineered to detect any aircraft that entered its range day or night, clear skies or cloud cover. It did not tire. It did not guess. It simply reported what it believed to be the truth. And for a time, that belief was rewarded. The shock came when Allied analysts began to see what the system could not do. Radar could detect reflections, but it could not interpret meaning. It could not decide which echoes represented aircraft and which did not. In test after test, the same conclusion emerged. When confronted with too many signals at once, the system collapsed under its own certainty. What looked like precision was, in fact, vulnerability. This realization carried a sharp irony. The very technology designed to give Germany total control of the night had no defense against deception. Radar was honest to a fault. It accepted every return as legitimate. When window filled the air with thousands of false echoes, the system responded exactly as it was designed to by reporting them all. The machines did not fail. They obeyed. Still, the path forward was not without struggle. Early Allied tests exposed technical challenges that could not be ignored. Strips had to be cut to precise lengths to reflect specific radar wavelengths. Release patterns needed to be calculated so that bombers would remain concealed rather than reveal themselves. Timing mattered. Altitude mattered. Even wind speed could determine success or disaster. Engineers worked under immense pressure, knowing that a flawed deployment could expose the tactic and render it useless. Crews trained carefully, often without fully understanding the importance of what they carried aboard their aircraft. Secrecy was absolute. Doubt remained. No one could be entirely sure that German defenses would respond as expected when faced with window on a large scale. Then came confirmation. Operational use proved what theory had promised. Radar stations reported overwhelming formations where none existed. Controllers issued contradictory instructions. Fighters were sent chasing ghosts. Bombers passed through defended airspace largely untouched, not because they were faster or stronger, but because they were no longer visible in any meaningful sense. For the first time, the Allies possessed something they had lacked since the air war began: a reliable way to survive the night. Window did not destroy German radar. It rendered it uncertain. And in war, uncertainty is often more paralyzing than loss. Yet even as this weakness was exploited, Allied commanders understood its temporary nature. Adaptation was inevitable. Countermeasures would follow. The flaw had been exposed, but it would not remain open forever. And as German engineers began searching for answers of their own, the contest between sight and deception was about to enter a far. How the window trick works is approximately equal to 475 words. The shock of window lay not in its appearance, but in its effect. From the bomb bays of Allied aircraft fell thousands of narrow strips of metal foil, each one cut with deliberate precision. As they drifted downward, spreading slowly through the air, they formed invisible clouds. To the human eye, they were meaningless fragments. To radar, they were aircraft, hundreds of them, sometimes thousands, all moving at once. German radar operators initially trusted what they saw. Their systems had been refined through years of testing and combat, designed to filter noise and focus on genuine threats. They believed their technology sophisticated enough to distinguish a bomber from interference. Training reinforced that belief. Radar returns were treated as fact, not hypothesis. The screen did not lie, or so it seemed. The irony emerged only when the screens became crowded. Window exploited a fundamental truth of radar physics. Metal reflects radio waves. Each strip behaved like a miniature aircraft, returning a signal indistinguishable from a real target. When released in sufficient quantity, these reflections overlapped, merged, and multiplied. The radar picture lost depth and clarity. What had once been a controlled sky became a storm of echoes. German attempts to counter the effect revealed the limits of their advantage. Operators adjusted gain, changed frequencies, recalibrated displays, but the returns persisted. Fighters scrambled toward phantom formations. Flak batteries opened fire into empty air. The more the system tried to interpret the data, the more confused it became. Radar was doing exactly what it was designed to do. That design was now being used against it. For the Allies, success was not automatic. The struggle lay in precision. Strips had to be cut to exact lengths to match German radar wavelengths. Too short, and they were invisible. Too long, and they betrayed their artificial nature. Dispersal patterns were tested repeatedly. Release too dense, and the deception became obvious. Too sparse, and bombers remained exposed. Wind conditions, altitude, and timing all mattered. Crews practiced releasing window in controlled intervals, creating corridors of confusion rather than chaos everywhere at once. The goal was not blindness, but misdirection, guiding German defenses away from real aircraft while preserving the illusion of overwhelming force elsewhere. When these variables aligned, the results were decisive. Radar stations reported massive incoming raids that never materialized. Defensive coordination broke down. Bombers passed through defended zones with losses dramatically reduced. For the first time, Allied crews felt something unfamiliar during night operations. Uncertainty had shifted to the other side. Window did not eliminate danger. It created opportunity. A temporary blind spot, fragile and fleeting, carved out of an otherwise lethal system. And as Allied planners learned to exploit that moment, they understood the first success is approximately equal to 475 words. Even with promising tests behind them, Allied commanders hesitated. Window represented opportunity, but also risk. Once revealed, its value might vanish. If the Germans adapted quickly, the deception would become a liability rather than an advantage. Plans were revised, postponed, debated in rooms thick with caution. No one wanted to gamble an entire bomber force on an idea that still felt fragile. That hesitation ended during a critical operation, when the pressure of war outweighed restraint. On the night of the mission, aircraft crossed the coast carrying not only bombs, but belief tempered by doubt. At the designated moment, crews released their bundles of foil into the darkness. Almost immediately, German radar screens flooded with returns. The picture became unreadable. Defenses hesitated, then fractured. What followed was unprecedented. Bombers passed through heavily defended airspace with minimal interception. Night fighters were vectored toward false formations. Anti-aircraft fire erupted far from the true flight paths. The radar network, once the backbone of German air defense, had been overwhelmed not by force, but by excess information. For the first time, The Allies moved through the night largely unseen. The irony was stark. Years of investment, engineering, and doctrine were undone by a technique so simple it bordered on the absurd. Window did not destroy radar stations. It did not silence transmitters. It rendered them irrelevant. The most advanced systems in the sky were reduced to guessing, and guessing in war is often fatal. Yet success brought its own struggle. Analysts reviewed data with caution, aware that one victory did not guarantee permanence. Variations in weather, radar frequencies, and enemy response all posed new challenges. If Window was to remain effective, it had to be refined continuously. Release patterns were adjusted, training intensified. Each raid became both an operation and an experiment. There was also the deeper understanding that surprise had been spent. German engineers would respond, countermeasures would come. The advantage Window offered was real, but temporary. The challenge now was not discovery, but discipline, using the tool decisively without revealing more than necessary. Still, the revelation could not be ignored. Loss rates dropped. Targets once considered unreachable were struck successfully. Crews returned with a renewed sense of possibility, not because the danger was gone, but because it could finally be managed. Confidence returned to night operations, grounded not in hope, but in demonstrated effect. Window had changed the equation. The Allies were no longer reacting to German control of the night. They were shaping it. And as planners began to integrate deception into every major operation, a new phase of the air war quietly began, one where seeing was no longer believing, and the skies themselves became contested illusions. What followed the first success was not celebration, but work. Window had proven itself, yet its continued value depended on discipline and refinement. Allied planners understood that deception, once revealed, demanded precision to remain effective. Bombing runs were redesigned around the careful release of foil, timed to minutes and meters. Crews were drilled until the motion became instinctive. In the dark over Europe, Window was no longer an experiment, it was procedure. With each operation, its role expanded. Window was no longer used only to conceal bombers. It shaped the entire geometry of the night sky. False corridors were created, phantom raids simulated, defenses drawn away from true targets. Radar operators below saw patterns that did not exist and missed those that did. The night, once a fixed battlefield, became fluid again, uncertain, unstable, and contested. The irony was unmistakable. What had begun as a modest countermeasure now sat at the heart of Allied air doctrine. Entire raids depended on it. Routes were chosen not just for distance or fuel, but for how deception could be layered across them. Sophisticated aircraft and trained crews now relied on strips of metal drifting silently through the air. Complexity rested on simplicity, and the balance held for a time. But pressure never receded. German defenses did not remain passive. Engineers studied radar logs, searching for patterns within the confusion. Operators were retrained to question what they saw. New filters were introduced. Visual confirmation was emphasized. The cat-and-mouse game accelerated, each side adapting in measured steps. Window still worked, but its margin of safety narrowed with every mission. For Allied crews, this uncertainty was constant. They flew, knowing that the protection surrounding them was temporary, invisible, and imperfect. Window did not guarantee safety. It delayed detection. It bought minutes, sometimes only seconds. Yet those moments were often enough. Bombers reached targets once considered unreachable. Rail yards, factories, and oil facilities burned under cover of confusion rather than darkness alone. The true revelation came not from any single raid, but from accumulation. German air defenses, strained by deception, were forced to spread resources thinner. Fighters chased false formations, while real bombers struck elsewhere. Flak ammunition was expended uselessly. Command decisions were delayed by uncertainty. Damage compounded, not because Window was invincible, but because it disrupted the rhythm of defense. Strategic targets suffered accordingly. Production slowed. Transportation networks fractured. Repairs lagged behind destruction. The air war shifted subtly but decisively. The Allies were no longer probing German defenses. They were penetrating them. Window did not win the war, but it opened paths through which force could be applied more effectively than before. Yet even as success mounted, restraint remained essential. Commanders resisted the temptation to rely too heavily on deception alone. Window was integrated, not substituted. Fighters still escorted where possible. Navigation improved. Intelligence refined target selection. The lesson was clear. Deception worked best when paired with discipline, not complacency. By blinding German radar, the Allies had not ended danger, they had redistributed it. The night grew more uncertain for everyone beneath it. Radar screens lied, orders conflicted, decisions were made with incomplete information. In that uncertainty, advantage shifted steadily westward. Still, those who understood the nature of the struggle knew the truth. No advantage born of surprise lasts forever. German countermeasures would continue to evolve. The window would narrow. One day, it might close entirely. But for now, the shock was unmistakable. German air defense reports began to contradict one another, filled with sightings that could not be confirmed and interceptions that led nowhere. Radar screens bloomed with formations that dissolved before fighters arrived. Commanders who had trusted their systems without reservation now faced an unsettling truth. The night no longer behaved as expected. Something fundamental had changed. Initial explanations were cautious. Weather interference, equipment malfunction, operator error. Yet the pattern persisted across regions and nights. German analysts soon recognized that the disruption was deliberate. The enemy was not evading radar, they were manipulating it. The realization struck at the heart of a system built on certainty. If radar could be deceived, then the very foundation of night defense was in question. German engineers responded with confidence rather than panic. They believed the solution lay in refinement. Filters were adjusted to suppress weaker returns. Operators were retrained to recognize patterns associated with deception. New procedures emphasized correlation between radar, sound detection, and visual confirmation. The assumption remained firm. Superior technology, properly adapted, would reassert control. Yet here lay the deeper irony. Each adjustment narrowed radar's sensitivity but did not restore clarity. Window was not a single trick, it was a principle. As German systems became more selective, they risked missing real aircraft, along with false ones. To see less was sometimes worse than seeing too much. The balance between discrimination and blindness proved difficult to maintain. The struggle intensified as new countermeasures were rushed into service. Modified radar sets attempted to separate moving aircraft from drifting foil. Night fighters were instructed to patrol visually rather than rely solely on ground control. Searchlights were repositioned. Flak doctrine was revised. But these measures demanded time, coordination, and resources commodities already under strain. Meanwhile, the Allies did not stand still. As German adaptations appeared, Allied planners adjusted release patterns and timings. Window clouds were layered, staggered, and combined with diversionary raids. Intelligence monitored German responses closely, identifying which defenses were tightening and which were failing. The contest evolved into a measured exchange, with each side probing the limits of the other's understanding. Despite their efforts, German defenses never fully recovered their former coherence. Radar could be improved, but not immunized. Every counter introduced new trade-offs, increased reliance on visual interception, reduced effectiveness in poor weather. Tighter radar filters created gaps. Coordination slowed as uncertainty crept into decision-making. The system still functioned, but with hesitation where there had once been confidence. The revelation, painful but unavoidable, was that adaptation had limits. Window did not permanently blind German radar, but it denied it dominance. The skies were no longer a controlled environment. They became a contested space, shaped by deception as much as detection. German commanders were forced to accept that certainty had been replaced by probability. This shift carried strategic consequences. Defensive reactions slowed. Resources were misallocated. Fighters were drawn away from genuine threats. Bombers reached targets more frequently, not because defenses were absent, but because they were misled. Damage accumulated incrementally, raid by raid, as the margin of error widened. In the end, German adaptation reduced but never eliminated the effectiveness of Window. The Allies retained the initiative, not through technological superiority alone, but through tempo. They forced the enemy to respond rather than anticipate. Each improvement arrived too late to restore full control of the night, and so the air war continued under altered conditions. Radar still scanned the skies, but it no longer commanded them. The illusion of mastery had been broken. As both sides prepared for the next phase of escalation, one truth had become clear. In a war defined by information, the side that shaped perception held the advantage, at least until perception itself changed again. The struggle that followed was unlike anything the air war had seen before. Bombers and fighters still flew, bombs still fell, but the decisive battles now unfolded invisibly. Window had forced both sides into a new kind of conflict, one fought not with speed or altitude, but with perception. Radar screens, once reliable maps of the sky, became contested ground where truth and illusion overlapped. For the Allies, success brought complexity. Each raid now required careful orchestration of signals as well as aircraft. Deception had to be layered, timed, and coordinated across wide distances. A false formation released too early could warn defenses. A corridor opened too late could expose bombers at the worst moment. The sky became a choreography of intent, shaped by radio waves rather than wings. The irony was unmistakable. Technology that once promised certainty now produced doubt. Radar, designed to reduce chaos, became a source of it. German defenses were forced to interpret rather than react, to question rather than trust. Every return demanded judgment. Every decision carried hesitation. The advantage of early detection had been transformed into the burden of interpretation. German responses followed the same pattern. New filters, revised doctrines, and hybrid tactics emerged, blending radar guidance with visual patrols and acoustic detection. Yet each adaptation carried cost. To see less noise was to risk missing real threats. To rely on pilots' eyes was to surrender the reach of machines. In trying to recover control, German defenses exposed their own limitations. As both sides adjusted, the air war entered a feedback loop. Every deception invited a counter. Every counter reshaped the next deception. Window was refined, not as a single tactic, but as a flexible tool, sometimes dense, sometimes sparse, sometimes paired with diversionary raids designed solely to consume enemy attention. The battlefield expanded beyond geography into the electromagnetic spectrum. This transformation carried a deeper revelation. Power no longer rested solely in destruction, but in disruption. The ability to confuse, delay, and misdirect became as valuable as firepower. An aircraft that was never intercepted could inflict more damage than one that fought its way through defenses. Survival itself became a strategic resource. What emerged was the early shape of electronic warfare, though few would have named it as such at the time. Signals were shaped deliberately. Information was denied selectively. Both sides learned that dominance depended not on seeing everything, but on controlling what the enemy believed they saw. The war above Europe became a contest of narratives written in radio waves. For the men in the aircraft, this invisible struggle was felt only in outcomes. Missions that once seemed suicidal now felt survivable. Routes opened where none had existed. Losses declined, not because danger vanished, but because it was redistributed. Risk moved elsewhere, often toward empty skies filled with illusion. On the ground, the implications were unsettling. Commanders accustomed to clarity now operated in ambiguity. Decisions were delayed. Resources were misdirected. The tempo of defense slowed, while offense gained momentum. Window had not destroyed German capability, but it had fractured its certainty, and certainty is the spine of coordinated defense. By forcing both sides into this war of signals, Window changed the nature of aerial combat permanently. Never again would technology be trusted without question. Never again would detection be assumed to equal understanding. The sky had learned to lie, and those who fought within it were forced to adapt. This chapter of the war did not end with a single victory or defeat. It unfolded gradually, shaping doctrine, expectation, and design. The lessons learned would echo far beyond the conflict itself, influencing how future wars would be planned and fought. And as the battle for perception continued night after night, one truth became unavoidable. In modern war, the shock emerged gradually. Then all at once, night after night, reports told the same story from different corners of occupied Europe. Allied bombers were reaching their targets in greater numbers, staying longer, and returning more often. Losses, once accepted as inevitable, began to fall. What had seemed like isolated successes now formed a pattern. The balance in the air was shifting. For Allied commanders, this change altered belief as much as strategy. Window, once guarded with caution, had proven itself under pressure. Combined with improved navigation, better coordination, and refined bombing techniques, it offered something the Allies had lacked for years: a way to contest German control of the night. Radar was no longer an unanswerable weapon. It could be challenged, shaped, and misled. This confidence did not arrive as triumphalism. It arrived as calculation. Planners understood that Window was not a shield, but a lever. Used correctly, it could open paths through defenses that had once been impenetrable. Used recklessly, it could lose its value entirely. Still, the fundamental equation had changed. The Allies were no longer reacting to German systems. They were forcing those systems to respond. The irony of the moment was unmistakable. Radar, designed to give Germany an insurmountable advantage, had become a liability under the right conditions. Its strength, its reliance on precise returns, was also its weakness. When fed false certainty, it delivered false confidence. Defenses moved decisively in the wrong direction, leaving real threats untouched. This shift marked a turning point in the air war. Allied bombers, once hunted relentlessly, now operated with a degree of initiative. Routes were planned with deception in mind. Targets once postponed were reassessed. Industrial centers, transportation hubs, and fuel facilities felt increasing pressure. The effectiveness of each raid rose not because bombs were more powerful, but because more aircraft survived to deliver them. German air defenses continued to function, but their rhythm was broken. Decisions took longer. Coordination suffered. Fighters were often late or misdirected. Flak fire grew less precise. The system that had once responded automatically now hesitated, forced to interpret instead of execute. In war, hesitation is often decisive. As the months passed, the cumulative effect became impossible to ignore. Damage across the Reich mounted steadily. Repair crews struggled to keep pace. Production schedules slipped. Rail networks fractured under repeated strain. None of this could be attributed to Window alone, but Window made it possible. It enabled pressure to be applied consistently, rather than sporadically. For the air crews themselves, the change was felt in subtler ways. Missions still carried fear, but no longer resignation. Survival seemed plausible. Skill mattered again. The night was dangerous, but not omnipotent. Crews learned to trust the planning behind them, not blindly, but with reason. Confidence returned not as bravado, but as steadiness. The revelation extended beyond immediate results. Allied leaders began to see that control of the air did not require total dominance. It required enough uncertainty on the enemy's side to disrupt coordination. Window had not destroyed German radar, but it had denied it authority. And without authority, even the most advanced system loses its strategic weight. By this stage, the direction of the air war was clear. The skies no longer favored Germany by default. Each raid forced German defenses to react under conditions of doubt. Each successful mission reinforced Allied momentum. The tide had not turned overnight, but it was unmistakably moving. Window served as a key enabler in this transformation, not because it was decisive on its own, but because it unlocked possibilities. It allowed strategy to evolve. It gave planners time and space. It turned survival into advantage. And as Allied operations grew in scale and ambition, one truth settled firmly into place. The era of uncontested German control of the night had ended. What lay ahead would be harder, larger, and more destructive, but the balance had shifted. The war in the skies was no longer a question of whether the Allies could endure. It had become a question of how far they could now go. The struggle that followed the turning of the tide was no less demanding, but it unfolded on altered terms. Allied bombers now reached deeper into German territory with increasing regularity, and each successful mission compounded the strain on defenses already under pressure. Radar stations still scanned the skies, but their warnings arrived late or conflicted. The Luftwaffe, once guided with precision, found itself reacting to fragments of information rather than clear direction. Germany's air defense network, designed for certainty, suffered under ambiguity. Interception rates fell as bombers slipped through corridors shaped by deception. Fighters rose into the night only to find empty skies or arrive too late to engage. Fuel, pilots, and aircraft were expended in pursuit of illusions. The system was not destroyed, but it was degraded, piece by piece, by doubt. The irony of this transformation was profound. What had begun as a small-scale, trick-thin strips of metal drifting on the wind had grown into a central pillar of Allied air operations. Window was no longer an auxiliary measure. It was woven into planning, timing, and execution. Its simplicity belied its reach. A tactic born of necessity now shaped strategy across an entire theater of war. As this integration deepened, a genuine turning point emerged. The Allies began to dominate the skies in a way they had not achieved before. Not through total air superiority in the modern sense, but through initiative. They chose when and where to strike. They forced German defenses into reaction rather than anticipation. Control shifted subtly but decisively. This new dominance carried visible consequences on the ground. Germany's industrial heartland felt sustained pressure. Factories halted production during repeated alerts. Transportation networks fractured under cumulative damage. Repairs lagged behind destruction as raids arrived with increasing frequency. The bombing campaign, once blunted by interception, now applied force with continuity. And continuity is what breaks systems. For Allied planners, Window had unlocked more than protection. It unlocked tempo. Raids could be mounted more often, with greater confidence and survivability. Targets could be prioritized strategically rather than opportunistically. The air war became less about endurance and more about effect. Each mission was no longer a gamble, but a calculated application of pressure. Within the Luftwaffe, the strain was evident. Pilots flew longer hours for diminishing results. Commanders worked with incomplete data. Decisions arrived too late or were based on false premises. Morale suffered not from a single defeat, but from erosion. The certainty that had once underpinned German air defense was gone, replaced by suspicion of every signal and hesitation in every order. The revelation, clear in retrospect, was that superiority in the air did not depend solely on numbers or machines. It depended on coherence. Window fractured that coherence. It forced the enemy to question the reliability of their own systems. In doing so, it shifted the balance from mechanical advantage to cognitive strain. Allied aircrews sensed this change, even if they could not always name it. Missions remained dangerous, but the danger felt navigable rather than absolute. Planning mattered, discipline mattered. Survival no longer felt arbitrary. The night sky, once ruled by unseen eyes, had become contested terrain once more. By this stage of the war, Window's significance extended beyond immediate tactical gains. It represented a broader transformation in how air power was applied. Deception was no longer an accessory to force, it was a force multiplier. Information, manipulated carefully, could shape outcomes as effectively as explosives. The success of Window marked a turning point not because it ended the air war, but because it redefined it. It allowed the Allies to exert sustained pressure on Germany's industrial core at a critical moment. It denied the enemy recovery time. It compressed margins until defenses bent under constant strain. As Allied operations expanded in scale and ambition, the implications became unavoidable. The skies no longer belonged to German certainty. They belonged to contested perception. And in that contest, the Allies now held the advantage. By 1944, the shock was no longer sudden, it was cumulative. German radar networks still existed on maps and schematics, but in practice, they had lost their former authority. Stations reported contacts that could not be confirmed, warnings that arrived too late, and patterns that dissolved under scrutiny. What had once been a coherent defensive system now operated in fragments, struggling to impose order on a sky that refused to behave. Years earlier, radar had promised mastery. It had offered Germany the ability to see beyond darkness, to intercept before bombs fell, to control the rhythm of the air war. Yet now, that promise rang hollow. Window had not destroyed the network physically. It had undermined its purpose. Detection no longer equaled understanding. Information no longer guaranteed action. The irony was unmistakable. One of the most advanced technological systems of the war had been neutralized not by a superior machine, but by simplicity. Thin strips of metal, unpowered, unremarkable, had exposed the limits of complexity. Radar could calculate, but it could not reason. It could report, but it could not judge. And when forced to choose between too much information and too little, it faltered. This failure marked a turning point in the air war. Allied bombing raids increased in frequency, scale, and ambition. Routes were planned with confidence that deception would fracture defenses before bombers arrived. German interception efforts grew less coordinated, less timely, and less effective. The defensive web that had once tightened around every incursion now sagged under constant strain. As radar reliability declined, so too did the cohesion of Air Defense Command. Fighters were launched based on incomplete or contradictory reports. Flak units fired defensively rather than decisively. Searchlights swept empty skies. Each response consumed resources without delivering results. The cost of uncertainty mounted night after night. For the Allies, the effect was decisive. Bombers reached strategic targets with increasing regularity. Industrial centers, oil facilities, and transportation hubs suffered sustained damage. Repairs lagged behind destruction, not because German engineers lacked skill, but because the tempo of attack no longer allowed recovery. Window enabled continuity, and continuity broke systems faster than any single blow. German efforts to adapt continued, but they arrived too late and progressed too slowly. Filters improved, procedures evolved, but each fix addressed symptoms rather than cause. Radar remained vulnerable to deception because deception had become intrinsic to the battlefield. The enemy was no longer simply flying through defended airspace, they were shaping the environment in which defense operated. The revelation, clear by this stage, was that Window had achieved more than tactical success. It had altered the balance between offense and defense. By denying radar certainty, it denied German air defense the confidence required for coordinated response. The result was not blindness, but hesitation, and hesitation proved fatal under sustained pressure. For Allied aircrews, the change was tangible. Missions remained dangerous, but the sense of inevitability was gone. Survival rates improved. Planning mattered. Execution mattered. The night sky, once ruled by unseen precision, had become unpredictable for those on the ground instead. Control had shifted. In retrospect, Windows stands as one of the quiet enablers of collapse. It did not win the war alone. It did not replace aircraft, crews, or strategy, but it allowed them to function effectively at a critical moment. It created space operational, psychological, and strategic where none had existed before. By the time Allied forces prepared for operations that would decide the war's final phase, German radar no longer shaped events. It reacted to them, imperfectly and too late. The consequences of Window extended far beyond tactical success. By the later years of the war, Germany's radar network, once the backbone of night defense, had been rendered largely ineffective as a system. Individual stations still functioned, but coordination had collapsed. Interceptions became sporadic. Bombers crossed defended airspace with a frequency that would have seemed unthinkable only a few years earlier. The ability to control the night had been shattered. This breakdown carried costs that were not immediately visible on damage reports. German air defense had been built on confidence in technology, on the assumption that machines could impose order on chaos. When that assumption failed, the entire structure wavered. Commanders hesitated. Operators second-guessed returns. Decisions slowed, not because information was absent, but because it could no longer be trusted. The irony of this transformation was striking. Radar had once represented a decisive advantage, a symbol of modernity and foresight. Now, in the face of Allied ingenuity, that advantage seemed almost trivial. The complexity that had inspired confidence became a liability when confronted with deception. What had appeared robust proved brittle under pressure. Window's true impact lay in what it revealed about innovation itself. The Allies did not outbuild or outcompute German radar. They outthought it. By understanding the assumptions embedded in the system, they exploited its blind spots. In doing so, they demonstrated that technological superiority is not absolute. It is conditional, dependent on context and adaptability. This lesson reshaped the war in the air. German defenses, once proactive, became reactive. Resources were diverted to patch vulnerabilities rather than advance capability. Each new countermeasure addressed yesterday's problem, while the Allies moved on to the next variation. The tempo of innovation shifted decisively, favoring those who could adapt faster rather than those who possessed the most advanced tools. For the men involved on both sides, this shift carried a human weight. German radar operators, trained to trust their instruments, now worked under constant uncertainty. Allied aircrews, aware that deception shielded them, also understood its limits. Window did not eliminate danger. It redistributed it. Success depended on discipline, timing, and restraint as much as on invention. The revelation was not that technology had failed, but that it had been misunderstood. Machines could extend perception, but they could not replace judgment. Radar could see, but it could not reason. When faced with a clever adversary, even the most advanced systems required human insight to remain effective. Without it, they became predictable. In the broader context of the war, Window marked a shift in how advantage was measured. Victory no longer depended solely on who possessed the most powerful devices, but on who understood their implications. Deception, once a supporting tactic, became central. Innovation was no longer about complexity, it was about insight. This carried implications far beyond the conflict itself. The war had revealed a new truth, that technological breakthroughs impose hidden costs. They create dependencies. They shape doctrine. And when those assumptions are exposed, the fall can be swift. Germany's radar network did not collapse because it was obsolete. It collapsed because it was too trusted. By the end of the war, the skies over Europe bore the imprint of this lesson. Signals were questioned, information was contested, certainty was no longer assumed. Window had changed the rules, not by adding power, but by demonstrating fragility. What remained was a quieter understanding, forged in darkness and radio waves. Innovation, without adaptability, invites defeat. And in that realization lay one of the war's most enduring lessons, a reminder that the true cost of technological dominance is paid not when it fails, but when it succeeds too completely, leaving no room for doubt. Behind the charts, radar screens, and operational summaries were people engineers, air crews, and planners, each grappling with the consequences of an idea that had grown far beyond its origins. For many of them, Window began as a technical problem, a modest solution to a lethal threat. Only later did its full weight become clear. What they had altered was not just a system, but the balance of expectation on which the war in the air had been fought. Engineers who worked on Window often spoke later of its simplicity with a sense of disbelief. There was no grand machine, no dramatic unveiling, just careful measurement, repeated testing, and an understanding of how the enemy thought. Pilots, too, felt the difference before they fully understood it. Missions that once seemed fatal now felt survivable. The night remained hostile, but it no longer felt omniscient. The irony was that this shift was never intended to be decisive. Early discussions framed Window as a temporary expedient, a way to reduce losses, not to change the course of the war. Yet over time, its effects multiplied. Each successful raid reinforced confidence. Each failure of interception eroded German certainty. What the Allies had initially viewed as a minor victory revealed itself as one of the war's most important turning points. This underestimation cut both ways. German air defense had trusted too completely in technological advantage, assuming that complexity equaled invulnerability. Allied planners, in turn, initially underestimated the broader implications of their own success. Window was more than a countermeasure. It was a demonstration of intellectual agility of the power to adapt faster than the enemy could respond. The true cost of underestimating an opponent's capacity for innovation was felt across the battlefield. German defenses reacted rather than anticipated. Resources were misallocated. Fighters were sent chasing illusions. Each misjudgment compounded the next. The result was not a single collapse, but a gradual unraveling of coherence that no amount of technical refinement could fully restore. For Allied air crews, the lesson was more personal. Survival had become possible not through heroics alone, but through insight. Discipline mattered. Trust in planning mattered. Window rewarded precision and punished complacency. Crews learned that by the end of the conflict, it was tempting to credit victory in the air to numbers, more bombers, more fighters, more fuel, more pilots. And yet, those who had watched the war unfold from its most dangerous heights understood a quieter truth. It was not just the aircraft that survived the night. It was the idea that protected them. It wasn't only the bombers or the fighters, it was Window that kept them safe. Window did not destroy cities or shoot down aircraft. It did something more subtle and ultimately more powerful. It altered the conditions under which war was fought. Before its introduction, Allied crews entered the night knowing they were seen, measured, and hunted. Afterward, they entered knowing that the enemy's vision could be deceived. That knowledge changed behavior, planning, and belief on both sides. The success of Window forces a reconsideration of how wars are won. History often favors the dramatic, the largest weapon, the fastest machine, the decisive battle. Window offered none of these. It was small, silent, and disposable. Its power lay not in force, but in insight. It worked because its creators understood the assumptions behind German radar and exploited them with precision. This simplicity was its greatest strength. Window did not demand new factories or vast resources. It demanded understanding. By turning radar's strength into a weakness, it revealed that technology is never neutral. Every system carries assumptions about the world. When those assumptions are exposed, even the most advanced tools can be rendered uncertain. In the skies over Europe, that uncertainty proved decisive. German air defenses did not collapse overnight, but they lost coherence. Confidence eroded. Decision-making slowed. Interception became unreliable. The Allies did not need to destroy radar to defeat it. They only needed to deny it certainty. And in war, certainty is often more valuable than firepower. Window also reshaped the human experience of combat. For Allied aircrews, survival was no longer a matter of chance alone. Planning mattered. Discipline mattered. The night was still dangerous, but it was no longer absolute. For German defenders, the opposite was true. The instruments they trusted began to lie. The sky could no longer be read with confidence. Control slipped away, not because of defeat in battle, but because of doubt. The broader lesson extends beyond this single innovation. Window demonstrated that adaptability can outweigh superiority. Germany possessed advanced technology, skilled engineers, and disciplined doctrine. What they underestimated was the enemy's ability to think differently. The Allies, by questioning first principles, changed the character of the fight. This is why Window's legacy endures. It marked one of the earliest moments when information itself became a primary battlefield. Signals, perception, and belief mattered as much as bombs and guns. Future wars would build on this lesson, but it was here drifting silently through the night that it first proved decisive. In the end, Window did not win the war by itself. Wars are never won by a single idea, but it enabled everything that followed. It made sustained pressure possible. It reduced losses. It restored initiative. It allowed strategy to function where survival once consumed all attention. And so, when historians look back at the war in the skies, they see more than aircraft and explosions. They see a quiet revolution, one born not of power, but of perception. A reminder that the most effective weapon is often not the one that strikes hardest,